How to knit a baby hat. If you are looking to start knitting, one of the best projects you can take on is learning how to knit a baby hat. You can create a baby hat out of just one skein of yarn, and you can complete it in just a few hours, giving you an instant sense of gratification. Even if you make mistakes, you can simply unravel and re-knit, learning as you go along. Instead of a bigger project which could end up unfinished, a baby hat knitting project allows you to feel like you have accomplished something within a short time. If you have already tried Googling online guides on how to knit a baby's hat, you must have noticed that most of them talk about the number of stitches or purls needed for a given row. This may be fine for someone who already knows how to knit, but it can be frustrating for one who needs to learn from scratch. If the baby hat knitting patterns you've encountered on the internet don't make sense to you, here's our comprehensive step-by-step tutorial. 1. You will need the following: a ball of wool in the color of your choice, 4.5mm knitting needles, a pair of scissors, some sewing thread, and a sewing needle. 2. Your baby hat project will start with 44 stitches of cast-on knitting. This is probably the most difficult part for a beginner. The good news is that the cast-on is not that hard. Begin by unraveling about a foot of wool. Create a loop a few inches in along the length of wool, and insert one knitting needle in the loop. Knot the wool around the needle, and you have created your first stitch. 3. Hold the first needle in your left hand. With the same hand, catch the tail end of the wool and keep it out of the way. Now take the second needle and insert it inside the first stitch, underneath the first needle. At this point, the two needles make an X, bound by the same loop of wool, with the first needle on top. Hold both needles in your left hand. 4. Take the loose end of the wool, the one leading to the rest of the skein, in your right hand. Hook it around the second needle, working your way from the back towards the front. It should end in the space between the two needles. You should see a loop of wool encircling the second needle. 5. Push the second needle down, leaving only the tapered tip holding onto the loop. Catch the loop with the tip of the first needle, sliding it off the second needle and moving it beside the first stitch. You now have 2 cast-on stitches. Continue until you have 44. 6. After you have completed the entire row, you will proceed to make about 60 rows, or about 5 inches of garter stitches. From the first row of cast-on knitting, you will need to have all stitches looped around the first needle, which you will be holding in your left hand. In your right hand, you will hold the second needle, which you will insert inside the loop of the last stitch, forming an X once again. Take the loose end of the wool and loop it under and over the second needle so that it ends in the space between the needles again. 7. As before, you will push the second needle down so that the loop slides down into its tapered end. Only this time you will catch the loop back onto the second needle and slide it up so that the stitch now wraps around the second needle, not the first. By repeating this, you will make an entire new row of stitches. 8. When you get to the end of the second row, simply switch the needles so that the last row of stitches is stringed along the needle you're holding in your left hand. Continue until you finish about 60 rows. 9. The last row of knitting will use the cast-off technique. This will prevent your knitting from unraveling. The cast-off or bind-off begins a new row with 2 basic stitches. Then put the first needle through the loop of the first basic stitch and hook it over the second basic stitch. The closed off loop ends on the second needle. 10. Continue closing off loops until you get to the end of the row. For the final 2 stitches, just pull the loose end of the skein tightly through. At this point, you will have a rectangular piece of knitting. Simply fold the rectangle into half, right sides together, then sew the sides to create a tube. Use a purse string stitch to close off the top of the hat, then turn it right side out. You have just successfully learned how to knit a baby hat. As you get more proficient with knitting, you will learn how to adjust the number of stitches in order to modify the hat size. Since you already know how to create rows of stitching, you can even take on a similar project on a larger scale, the infinity scarf.